Welcome to The Lead, the New Lines magazine podcast. I'm Danny Postel, the magazine's politics editor, and this is a podcast where we delve into the biggest ideas, events, and personalities from around the world. After a week of renewed conflict between Israel and Palestine, the outlook for the Middle East appears more uncertain and more complex than it has for years. Hamas's assault, what it calls Operation Al-Aqsa Flood, and the ensuing Israeli onslaught on Gaza are being described as a game changer. A psychological barrier has been shattered, one observer has written. 50 years after another surprise attack started the 1973 war, this week's events have shifted the dynamic between Hamas and Israel, and more broadly between Israel and the rest of the region. To understand the genesis of the crisis, the calculations of Hamas militants in launching this assault, the emotional and political temperature in an Israel still blindsided from a surprise attack, and what the unfolding conflagration means for the future of the Israeli-Palestinian issue, my colleague Joshua Martin and I spoke to political scientists from 3 different countries. In this episode of the podcast, you'll hear from Dana El-Kurd, who teaches political science at the University of Richmond and is a non-resident senior fellow at the Arab Center, Washington, D.C. She is the author of the book Polarized and Demobilized: Legacies of Authoritarianism in Palestine. She joins us from Richmond, Virginia. You'll also hear from Uriel Abulof, who teaches political science at Tel Aviv University. His books include Living on the Edge, The Existential Uncertainty of Zionism, and The Mortality and Morality of Nations. He joins us from Jerusalem. But first, my colleague Joshua Martin spoke to Jeroen Gunning, professor of Middle Eastern politics and conflict studies at King's College London. He's the author of the book Hamas and Politics: Democracy, Religion, Violence, and co-author of Terrorism, A Critical Introduction. He's one of the founders of the field of critical terrorism studies. Josh began by asking him about the conflicting outlooks between Hamas and its rival Palestinian political party, Fatah.
Jeroen, welcome to The Lead. Thanks for making time for us today.
Thank you for having me on the program.
So, first of all, we should be very clear that the Palestinian movement is divided. The attacks last Saturday were carried out by Hamas, which controls Gaza, but the West Bank is governed by the Palestinian Authority under the ruling Fatah party. Now, the two are rivals with conflicting outlooks. So, for listeners who may be catching up on the details, could you just go over the sort of important differences between them?
Yeah, so Hamas emerged as an Islamist party rather than a nationalist party as Fatah or the various leftist parties that were the sort of the earlier armed Palestinian groups. So it's seeking a greater role for Islam in politics in principle. And this has an impact on how they view the conflict. They partly view it through a nationalist lens, but on top of that, there's kind of an Islamic lens, for example, defending the Al-Aqsa Mosque in Jerusalem, which is the third holiest site in Islam. But then Fatah also does that. So in some ways, there's actually quite a lot of overlap as well. The main Islamist rival of Hamas is Palestinian Islamic Jihad, but this is a much smaller organization and it doesn't have the political clout that Hamas has or its extensive social welfare programs. But one other thing I think to note is that Hamas is in some ways quite like Fatah in that it runs a government. It's the de facto government of Gaza. Of course, it has won elections in the past in 2006. It has a large political party apparatus, as well as an armed wing, which doubles as Gaza's armed forces. So there are also similarities that can easily be overlooked.
But in terms of their approach to Israel in particular, they have quite divergent views, right?
Yeah.
Hamas is much more hardline.
Yeah, Fatah and the Palestinian Authority have signed peace agreements with Israel in the past. They accept a two-state solution where a Palestinian state would be created on the 1967 borders, and then they've recognized Israel. Hamas has moved closer to this than when it emerged in the 1980s. In the 1980s, it categorically said it wanted to liberate all of historic Palestine and establish an Islamic state there. Over the years, particularly around sort of 2005 to 2007, and then again in the mid-2010s, it has kind of moved to saying on paper and in various signed agreements that it would accept a Palestinian state on the 1967 borders, so implicitly agreeing to a two-state solution. But, and this is where their ideological position is different from Fatah, they still refuse to recognize Israel. But I think it's important that at least the political wing within Hamas has been moving closer towards accepting a two-state solution because they see this as the national consensus in Palestinian politics.
So back in 2009, you actually quite literally wrote the book on Hamas. So I was wondering, what's new or different about today's Hamas compared to the Hamas back then?
So one thing which is, of course, very clear is that the extremity of the violence on Saturday was shocking and much more than Hamas has done in the past. In the past, it has targeted civilians, it has carried out suicide operations or what they call self-martyrdom operations, etc. But so the size of the attack and doing it on Israeli soils with armed militants breaking out of Gaza into Israel, that is a new thing. And I think it's difficult to try to make sense of this kind of shocking violence. But I would say there are three clusters of reasons that pushed Hamas to adopt these more extreme tactics. One is the situation in the West Bank. It's long been the case, as there's been this rivalry between Fatah in the West Bank and Hamas in Gaza, that if there were crisis situations in the West Bank, Hamas would start launching rockets in order to show that they also matter in the Palestinian movement overall. I think what's interesting here is that before the fighting this weekend, already over 230 Palestinians had been killed in the West Bank this year alone, and there had been over 1,000 attacks by Israeli settlers. And also surveys have shown that over the past year, there's been a very sharp increase in people in the West Bank thinking that another intifada, another uprising is necessary. So one calculation is that by having a more extreme attack, it might be possible to galvanize the West Bank into a full-blown uprising. The other reason has to do with the 16-year-old blockade of Gaza itself, the siege. There have been a number of wars over the last 16 years where Hamas has very explicitly tried to use the violence to push Israel to end the siege. And those wars have failed. And there have also been a number of political initiatives, including Hamas issuing this new manifesto where it said that it would accept a Palestinian state on the 1967 borders in 2017. So the kind of the more politically minded pragmatists within Hamas seem to have been sidelined. There seemed to have been no outcome of what they were trying to do in terms of their compromise. And then in addition, there's kind of the previous violence that Israel has meted out to Gazans specifically. And it's important to remember, if we want to understand Hamas, that since 2008 and until this conflict, for every Israeli civilian killed by Hamas, 21 Palestinian civilians were killed in Israeli attacks, and most of them in Gaza. So one calculation might be to try and change the rules of the game regarding the blockade, but also a revenge for what Palestinians have suffered. And then the final reason is the regional situation combined with what's happening in Israel. So in Israel, you have the most right-wing government in its history, with a lot of vocal voices calling for annexation of large parts of the West Bank. And that would, of course, mean that a Palestinian state would just no longer be possible to the extent that it still is.
Right.
And that combines with the regional situation, with Israel making a number of normalization agreements with Arab states and rumors of Saudi Arabia being close to such an agreement. And Saudi Arabia has been historically kind of a stalwart defender of Palestinian rights. And so even though they haven't been very active in the last decade, symbolically, Saudi agreeing on normalization with Israel without there being a Palestinian state would have been sort of the final straw. And that means that there would not be a Palestinian cause left after that. So again, that would have pushed them into doing something more extreme to try and change the whole narrative of the region.
Okay, right. I mean, how successful would you say they've been? Because, I mean, the attacks were truly horrifying, and the response has been no less so. I mean, we're seeing openly eliminationist rhetoric from many quarters against Palestinians. For the Palestinians, the result of these attacks has been catastrophic, and it's hard to imagine that Hamas didn't see that coming. So what was the strategic logic there? Did they really not expect the response to be quite as violent as it has been? Do you think they've actually succeeded in their goals?
So this is more difficult to understand because, as you say, I mean, they would have known what's coming. Because, I mean, one of the things that they tried to do, which the leader of Hamas's political bureau said in a speech on Saturday, they wanted to show that Israel wasn't even capable of protecting its own land. Therefore, all the states in the Gulf who were hoping that Israel would help them against Iran would have to see that Israel isn't actually a reliable security partner. That was the rhetoric that Hamas was giving. But what's interesting there, so I think there's a number of things happening. So one is that, of course, they would have known that by invading Israel itself and sort of puncturing this myth of invincibility of Israel in its own land, Israel would have to respond even more harshly than normal in order to prevent any other groups from doing the same thing, right? So that already would have been sort of calculated in.
Right.
I think from Hamas's perspective, in terms of the military wing, they look at sacrifice and martyrdom in a very different way. They accept that a lot of people will have to die for a longer term goal. And so one calculation might be that as about 10 years ago in 2014, when there was another big Israeli ground offensive, Hamas, through its preparation of the urban area, because Gaza is very densely populated.
Right.
So with a network of tunnels, with booby traps, with anti-tank mines, etc., they managed to ground the Israeli offensive to a halt and so exact a high price of lives of Israeli soldiers. Plus also, of course, the devastation on Gaza itself, which then pushed the international community to push for a ceasefire. So that might be one of their logics. But the other thing which is interesting in terms of the regional situation, Saudi Arabia immediately on Saturday came out very strongly against Israel, saying that they blamed Israel for the violence and saying if you only had ended the siege of Gaza and agreed to a Palestinian state, this wouldn't have happened. So they swung very clearly behind the Palestinians. And then the crown prince of Saudi Arabia, who's the de facto ruler, had a phone call with the president of Iran, the first time since the rapprochement earlier, where he was sort of emphasizing the need to stand with the Palestinians and push for a Palestinian state. So that narrative, at the moment at least, in Saudi Arabia has changed quite dramatically. So it may be that Hamas' calculation was that this was worth the cost, but of course they're also sacrificing the lives of thousands of Palestinians in Gaza.
Yeah, I want to ask you a bit more about that, because Hamas has been rising in popularity in recent years somewhat. But I can't imagine that the people of Gaza feel that good about being signed up as a mass sacrifice by Hamas. Do you think this is going to affect Hamas's legitimacy in the eyes of Palestinians?
I think it depends very much on what happens next, on the scale of Israel's attack, on how Hamas defends itself. It's interesting that in past conflicts, usually after the conflict has ended, Hamas's popularity increases, because there's kind of a sense that Hamas is at least doing something. It's standing up to Israel in a way that Fatah is seen as ineffective. It hasn't achieved the kind of goals it set out to do. So there's that kind of dynamic at work. And it's interesting, just a month ago, there was a poll and people were asked who they would vote for if there were elections tomorrow. 45% of Gazans said they would vote for Hamas, and 28% said they would vote for Fatah. So there was still a groundswell of support for Hamas, even though people believe that the Hamas government has become corrupt in a way that it wouldn't have been 15 years ago. So I think one of the ways to try and understand it is that although people, of course, don't want to be bombarded, they don't want to be killed, there's also a sense that life in Gaza is just unbearable. I mean, to have been stuck in Gaza for 16 years, I mean, most Gazans have not been out of Gaza. A lot of the militants that would have broken out of Gaza at the weekend, that would have been their first time outside. Within Gaza, 80% of the population is dependent on humanitarian aid. 50% is living on the poverty line, a third under the poverty line. So in terms of life in Gaza, it is very painful. And the water is bad, there's not enough electricity. So you can also see that at least some part of the Gazan population would support Hamas because it is trying to do something about that. But when you look at Twitter, or what used to be called Twitter, and so people saying, I don't know what's happened to my family, I haven't been able to get into that area that's been bombed. When Netanyahu says that the Gazan civilians need to leave Gaza, they can't leave. There's a field that can leave via the Egyptian border, but people are stuck there and there's nowhere to hide. I mean, the way Israel has responded by saying we're just going to block everything around Gaza until the hostages are freed, and so there's no fuel, no food, no electricity going in, and that's going to be devastating for Gaza. It's also, and this is on both sides, I mean, on both sides, parties are breaking international humanitarian law and the laws of warfare. I mean, for example, to hold a siege like this and starve a population as a war crime. What Hamas did on Saturday is very clearly a war crime on many different levels. So it is going to be very interesting to see how this plays out, because at the moment, I think the shock of Saturday has meant that a lot of the international community is increasing their support for Israel. And so where in 2014, for example, there would have been voices saying, please hold back. I don't see that happening this time because the violence was so shocking. And I think that might have been a miscalculation for Hamas.
Yes, I mean, I've seen people compare it to the height of the war on terror in terms of the climate, the temperature, and how much that's been raised recently, which kind of brings me, I suppose, to my last question. As you said, the Netanyahu government has opted for a course of maximal retaliation. But there have been some prominent Israeli voices, Gaza countless times over the past decade. The siege has been ongoing, and it doesn't seem to have made Israelis any safer. By design, an attack of this magnitude demands a response of some kind. But as a scholar who's been very critical of a lot of the conventional wisdom around terrorism, I wondered if you had any thoughts on how governments, the Israeli government, foreign governments should respond. I mean, is there a better way to prevent something like this happening again in the future?
Well, I think that there are different layers to an answer. One is, as you say, that it is actually very hard to eliminate Hamas from Gaza militarily. Israel has tried to do this with Hezbollah in Lebanon, with Hamas before in Gaza. If you have a movement like that, which has support, at least from a part of the population, and it can blend back into the population, it is almost impossible to eradicate that. And even if they manage to kill a large part of the leadership, Hamas's kind of structure is very horizontal. So in the past, they've been very fast at replacing leaders that have been killed.
Right.
And that then just adds to the mythos around them. So I think that's one element of it. And a lot of Israelis, including former heads of the Mossad and former generals, have gone on record that there is no military solution to the Palestine-Israel conflict, and certainly not to the Gazan conflict. So there has to be a political solution at some point. And it's interesting that Tony Blair, who was, of course, the Middle East envoy for a long time, and of course, the Prime Minister of the UK before that, that he said recently that in retrospect, it was a mistake by the international community to boycott Hamas when it won the elections in 2006. And this is in some ways the irony and also sort of almost the impossibility of where we are now, because for there to be an end to the conflict, there needs to be some kind of engagement with the political wing of Hamas and the pragmatists within the movement, if they are still there. Because, I mean, Fatah doesn't represent the Palestinians anymore. There's a lot of people who are against it. So just negotiating with Fatah wouldn't achieve anything. You would need to get the more violent actor somehow at the table, which, of course, at this stage, after what Hamas has done, is going to be less likely because people are not in that kind of frame of mind. And in part, what has made this attack possible has been the way that both the Israeli government and international governments have isolated Hamas and pushed it into a corner where all the political options were cut off. And I think that then changes the political opportunity structure that a movement like Hamas faces.
It empowers the hardliners.
Yeah, and empowers the hardliners. And I mean, although at this stage, of course, this is a very unpopular view, but it seems to me that the only way forward ultimately would be some kind of a political solution, which would have to be agreed with hardline parties like Hamas. I don't see any other way around it. But of course, what Hamas has done and what the hardliners particularly have done is make that almost impossible.
Right. But I mean, the Netanyahu government, the very right-wing government, as you say, the most right-wing government in Israeli history, this happened on Netanyahu's watch, and a lot of Israelis have been blaming him for this. So I wonder if longer term, those more pragmatic voices that would like to find a lasting solution, whether you think they might have a chance of taking a more prominent place in the conversation in the coming months.
Yeah, I think it's a possibility, and I think it would certainly be welcome. What's interesting, of course, is that in spite of everything that happened and the shockingness and the brutality of it, there is quite a long history of Hamas negotiating with Israel indirectly, right? Every war that has happened since 2006, Hamas has negotiated a ceasefire with Israel through Egypt or other brokers. Every hostage situation when soldiers were kidnapped have involved negotiations behind the scenes, sometimes with international actors acting as a go-between.
Right.
And it's interesting when you talk to some of the officers in the Israeli army that, for example, in the north, there's a lot of indirect negotiations with Hezbollah in terms of keeping that border calm. So there is actually quite a lot of expertise within Israel and also within parts of Hamas that would be able to take these negotiations forward. The problem, of course, is on both sides, I think the hardliners are in control and they've captured the narrative and the whole direction of where the conflict is going. And so the challenge will be what will happen to the non-hardliners on both sides. And what's interesting is that in some of the past wars, the Qassam brigades have been criticized by Palestinians for the violence that they have invited on Gazans and for not fighting well enough against Israelis, which then kind of created an opportunity for some of the political pragmatists after those conflicts to come to the fore again.
Yes.
But I mean, a lot, of course, depends also on how many people will be alive after the offensive, which I'm expecting to be very bloody, right? And so that would also be difficult then to have a negotiation with people who don't have that experience of negotiations in the past, however indirect they were. And you might have a younger generation that is even more hardline.
Jeroen Gunning, thank you very much.
You're very welcome.
Joshua Martin there speaking to Jeroen Gunning in London. With Hamas in control in Gaza, the spotlight will also turn to the Palestinian Authority on the West Bank. Dana El-Kurd spoke to me from Richmond, Virginia, and I started by asking for her assessment of the strategic logic behind Hamas's decision to launch their attack. Dana, welcome to the Lead.
Thank you so much for having me.
So, as a scholar of internal Palestinian political dynamics, I'd like to start just by asking you, how do you read the momentous events currently unfolding? And specifically, why do you think Hamas launched this unprecedented assault? What, to use political science terms, what was the strategic logic behind that decision as you read it?
Yeah, so the situation on the Palestinian kind of political stage is that many of the other actors in Palestine have given up the pretense of quote unquote resisting the status quo or the Israeli occupation. And this is very clear, I think, to the Palestinian public. Whereas Hamas is one of the groups, one of the few groups that still claims that and still claims resistance against the Israeli occupation. So, what this moment speaks to is the fact that a lot of these other Palestinian actors have become very irrelevant to the ongoing conflict, to the Palestinian liberation movement, however tenuous and fragmented it is, and that Hamas is seizing the kind of vacuum that leaves in place to say, we are the ones who represent Palestinian aspirations, or we're the ones who claim resistance and things like this. But I do have to say also that we're shocked and surprised by the scope of the attack and by, some of the details that are coming out about the attack. But if that attack hadn't happened a few days ago, then something else would have happened, because the status quo as a whole was trending to this kind of mass violence.
Explain that a bit more. How was the status quo trending towards some sort of event, whether this or something else, as you say?
Well, research has shown, and my own research has shown as well, that what's happening is Palestinians recognize the conditions that they're engaging in, which essentially is a condition of increased repression. Everyday life is becoming more and more difficult and violent, whether it's in the West Bank or Gaza. And on top of that, political alternatives either are repressed or are hollowed out to be meaningless. So anytime Palestinians have engaged in any other strategy, it has been either criminalized by the Israelis, criminalized by the international community, or heavily repressed. I mean, a year or two ago, we had the Palestinian civil society organizations that were shut down and labeled as terrorist organizations by the Israeli government. I mean, this is the scope of the shutdown in Palestinian politics. So I think, back to your question about strategic logic, it's becoming kind of clear to Palestinians living in the occupied territories that there's no other form of strategy that they can pursue. And when I say strategy, I don't mean that this is necessarily going to have the most effective impact or have such a sizable impact or even benefit. Those are all debatable. But when we see young men in places like the old city of Nablus or in Jenin camp, even if they know that they're heavily outgunned and all of that, they're still engaging in armed resistance and armed tactics. And we see these kinds of attacks. I mean, again, the scope of this one was very large, but anything that's coming out of Gaza, it's the same logic. It's that everything else has been shut down and there doesn't seem to be a way forward. On top of that, the international community is sidelining us, is not keeping the Palestinian question relevant to its policies, whether that's American policies or anything else. And I think that's what makes groups like Hamas gain traction, gain popularity, and be able to justify this kind of action, even when, as we've seen, it has a huge, devastating impact on people in Gaza.
Yeah, that's exactly what I wanted to ask you about next. One of the things that I love about your book and I learned from was the array of survey data about Palestinian public opinion on a wide range of issues, broken down in all sorts of illuminating ways, much of it based on your own interviews with a range of people over several years. So let me ask you, as someone who's done extensive research on this, and specifically on how Palestinians view their political leaders, though your book deals mostly with the Palestinian Authority, how popular is Hamas amongst Palestinians in Gaza? And secondly, do you think that Operation Al-Aqsa Flood has increased or decreased that support? I think you've already hinted at it, but let me ask you directly.
So I do want to point out that we have polling every 3 months from the Palestinian Center for Survey and Policy Research. People can look online and see these trends. But it's important to note that, like, when we say support for Hamas, that kind of support, quote unquote, like, that's a data point, but it can mask a lot of different motivations for why people say they support Hamas. There could be a segment of society that is an actual, like, ideological adherent to Hamas as a political and militant group, right? But then there's also the people who say they support Hamas as a foil to Fatah, as a foil to the Palestinian Authority. Oftentimes, the support for Hamas means we do not support the status quo. So I think that when we look at these data points, it can kind of flatten those different motivations that go into people's answers. I mean, this is typical of polling anyway, like, not just in the Palestinian context. So I've heard a lot of people say, like, Palestinians should be condemned because they voted for Hamas in 2006. But first, they only want a plurality. It wasn't like a large majority. And then second, it was clearly a referendum vote about the Oslo Accords. So that was back then. Today, the polling shows that if Palestinians were asked that if elections were held between Mahmoud Abbas and the head of Hamas, Ismail Haniyeh, that 56% say Haniyeh would win and 33% want Abbas to win. So in terms of that, people see Mahmoud Abbas as being very unpopular, whereas, like, the Hamas counterpart is slightly more popular, or, like, about 50%. But then when we look at, like, the question on parliamentary elections, Hamas receives 34% of the popular vote and Fatah receives 31%. So it's not that far off. And it seems like it's not that big of a show of support in this kind of polling. What is interesting about this polling is that 71% of Palestinians polled both in the West Bank and Gaza say that they support armed tactics. So that's where you see, like, if you kind of look through the polling just at a single data point, you're not going to get that nuance. But when you take this in its entirety and look at all of these data points together, if there is support for Hamas, it likely has to do with the fact that, like I said, they represent, in people's eyes, a challenge to the status quo. So I think that's what I would say about, support, quote unquote.
Right. And it's too early because, as you say, this survey data comes out every 3 months?
Yes. So
it's too early to know.
We don't know. Yeah, exactly.
But
so to be clear, like, in the context of Israel bombing Gaza, there is obviously a rally around the flag effect, where even people who have reservations or maybe are completely ideologically opposed to Hamas are not going to express something like that. And we see slight bumps in their popularity in the last couple of years, like in the immediate aftermath of the Unity Intifada in 2021, where Hamas did launch rockets during those events. So we do see small bumps, but I think that can be attributable to the rally around the flag effect. Now, in Gaza, I'm sure that if there's polling, I don't know if there's going to be a possibility for polling in the next, in the near future. But if we were to see polling in the next couple of weeks or months, like, we might see a bump, but that still doesn't say much about how people view their governance or view their strategy. And in fact, just very recently, we had protests in Gaza about living conditions. So, yeah.
Yeah, that's interesting. And I realize you're not there on the ground right now, but what's your sense of the psychological temperature, if you will, amongst Palestinians in Gaza after the assault and as Israel responds to it?
So yes, I'm not on the ground. I have not lived in Palestine for some time, but I think I follow pretty closely. And I think that in the immediate aftermath, like in the first hours of the event, when information was not fully, or I mean, still, we really don't have clarity on everything that has happened. And there's a lot of disinformation as well. But in the immediate aftermath, when people started to see pictures of the fence torn down by bulldozers, they saw, I think, a video of like people climbing on a jeep, an Israeli army jeep. There was an immediate show of support amongst Palestinians because this was the first time that they had seen the blockade of Gaza challenged in that way. And then as information came out, I think people started to, nuance maybe their views. But at the same time, the immediate attack and the immediate siege and all of that is, I mean, I can't describe how outraged people are, how just dehumanized people feel, that violence against Palestinians is ignored, and the international community is greenlighting a very heavy-handed response. And I think it's really damaging to Palestinians and the possibility for peace. I mean, I'll be honest, like, I always thought that peace, like the possibility of some peaceful resolution, was very narrow and fleeting. But in the events of the last couple of days, I feel like that is no longer a possibility.
So it's been shut down now.
I mean, yeah, I don't mean to be alarmist or overly sensationalist, but like, I can't describe how zero-sum this has become in people's minds.
And what does this conflagration mean, do you think, for the Palestinian Authority, which your book is centrally about? What might it mean for them if the war drags on and if there are all sorts of casualties and they can't do anything about it?
I mean, they have these kinds of events, again, demonstrate to the Palestinian public how irrelevant the Palestinian Authority is. I think they will, I mean, as has been going on for quite some time in the West Bank and increasing in frequency, when Palestinians die in the West Bank, the Palestinian Authority cannot protect them. There is, a security coordination between them and the Israeli forces. And all of that is really angering people. So I imagine that, like, if this were to go on for quite some time, or, just as we come to grips with the severity of what is happening, I would not be surprised at all if the Palestinian Authority was to face, sustained protests or even armed attack, given the kind of mood in the Palestinian territories right now.
Dana, there's a lot of discussion about Iran's relationship with Hamas. You've been sharply critical of the Islamic Republic in general, its regional role in the Middle East, particularly in the Syrian conflict and beyond. But it strikes me that these events have brought the rhetoric of the so-called axis of resistance back from the dead, in a sense. That paradigm seemed to be moribund amidst the Syrian conflict, and especially with the 2019 uprisings in Lebanon and Iraq, where Iran and Hezbollah took the side not of the protesters, but of the regimes and establishments that they were protesting against, which revealed the whole notion of the axis of resistance to be something of a zombie category, to use Ulrich Beck's phrase. Our mutual friend Joey Ayoub captured this irony, I think, when he described Hezbollah's resistance, capital R, trademark, against actual resistance on the streets. So I'm wondering, now that Hamas has a complicated relationship with the axis of resistance, right? On the one hand, it's squarely part of it with its deep ties to Iran and Hezbollah. But on the other hand, it didn't share their stance on the Syrian conflict. So there are some fault lines there. But in the present equation, to get to my question for you, do you sense that the axis of resistance rhetoric is sort of back? And as a critic yourself of the authoritarianism of that constellation, the problematic and regressive nature of this resistance politics regionally, what might a return to that paradigm mean?
Yeah, it's an important question. For me, I would say I never saw it recede. I've always noted that these kinds of ideas and these very shallow, frankly, ideas about an axis of resistance have percolated, especially amongst the left, for quite some time. I think amongst people of conscience, the events of Syria showed this to be, a vacuous notion, but that's like a very, I don't know, that's not the biggest segment. I think that people do have very reductive understandings of what happened in the Middle East. And I've noticed that these kinds of ideas have percolated. But I think what makes them worse is the fact that the international community and leftist and progressive movements elsewhere outside of the region have not shown adequate solidarity to people in Palestine. And then this lends credence to the idea that the other side, this kind of authoritarian axis of resistance, are our true allies. I mean, you mentioned Hamas and having a complicated relationship with Iran. Like, Hamas took a position during the Syrian revolution, and its ties to Iran were cut for quite some time.
And it shut down, it closed its office in Damascus, I believe.
Yes, exactly, and moved. And the fact that they have since returned to the fold shows the degree to which the international community has suffocated other alternatives, and shows the degree to which the left has failed in articulating alternatives as well. So instead of thinking about a progressive or leftist constellation of organizations or movements that can have like a nuanced take on both Syria and Palestine and all the other, anti-authoritarian struggles that exist in the region, it's become this binary. I mean, to a normal person, like, how do you explain this? When you see on one side, the Iranian government and Iranian officials are like claiming support for you, and on the other, the international community shows hypocrisy around questions of Palestine versus Ukraine. You see the Ukrainian president supporting Israel. So it's very difficult to the average person to look at this and not think that this binary is valid, and then also not see, or maybe look away from some of the contradictions on that side of the authoritarian axis of resistance. So it's, for me, deeply depressing that I don't know what to tell Palestinians who are living in the occupied territories, who have these conditions that they're dealing with. What do you tell them? I mean, you tell them Russia did this in Syria, and Iran did this to its own people, and Iran has killed people in Iraq, and Iran has killed people in Syria, and they represent this horrific religious extremism, both them and Hezbollah, and don't take their support or ignore their support. Or, I mean, you can't even have this conversation with people who have the boot on their neck.
Dana El-Kurd, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
Dana El-Kurd speaking to me from Richmond, Virginia.
As Israel's military response gets underway, Uriel Abulof spoke to me from Jerusalem. I wanted his sense of his country's mood in the aftermath of Saturday's shock.
Uriel, welcome to the Lead.
Thank you, Danny. Thank you so much.
We appreciate you joining us. I wanted to ask you, one writer for the Israeli magazine 972 has observed that the events of last weekend have shattered a psychological barrier as consequential as the physical one. He says there's been a seismic psychological shift in the country. As someone who writes about political psychology yourself, and specifically about the political psychology of Israel and Israelis, I'm wondering what you can tell us about the current emotional temperature in the country following Hamas's gruesome assault, and also the emotional temperature as the Israeli government responds to that assault with a ground invasion looking imminent. What are Israelis thinking and feeling amidst all of this, including yourself?
It's interesting that you use the analogy of temperature. I think that there is an interesting mismatch going on. On the one hand, the temperature is very high when it comes to the Israeli public. There is a sense that I share that we are heartbroken, immense sadness, mourning. It's a lingering pain, an element of amazement, I guess in the first couple of hours, even the first couple of days, an aspect of denial. There's also a lot of rage, and the rage, I think, is interestingly directed towards those who are considered to be cold-hearted. That is the current government. So if the temperature is high when it comes to the Israeli public, in the eyes of many, it is way too low when they behold the government. There is an interesting mismatch going on there.
Can you explain that a little bit more? What is the mismatch exactly?
If you look at Netanyahu's speeches since that catastrophe, and when you look at him, when you listen to him, and especially once you compare his reaction to US President Biden, The difference is striking. Netanyahu seems to be talking in an almost robotic-like way, almost devoid of emotion. He's, in some ways, saying the right words, at least occasionally, but Israelis on social media have commented how dull his eyes looked, the body language that he projected, very little compassion. And although it's not new when it comes to Netanyahu, I think it has become more striking, more painful, more enraging for many Israelis, since now the gap between what they feel, what we feel, and what he seems to be feeling, if he feels anything, appears all the more devastating, almost unreal. And again, many, I think, reacted to that, especially following Biden's speech, which was full of emotion, of empathy. Netanyahu may be lacking that aspect in his personality.
That's very interesting, especially when you think about the protests that have engulfed Israel over the last several months in response to the Supreme Court judiciary overhaul and what's often called the Orbanization of Israeli politics. I mean, in many ways, that divide in the country seems to have closed as the country comes together in response to these attacks. There's a new unity government. Many have commented that whatever their differences on domestic Israeli politics have been, those are being set aside in the face of this common threat at the moment. So I'm wondering, as you describe Netanyahu's response and body language and people's reactions to it, is there a connection? Do these protests of the last several months and the deep divisions within Israeli society, although they've been set to the side in one sense, are they still present in some other sense?
It's hard to answer that, not least, of course, because the experience is very individualized, the experience of mourning. It's hard to tell at this point what is the collective sentiment. You can see bits and pieces of the individual or sometimes the family sentiment, often in live broadcasting when survivors are interviewed. But it's very hard to speak of any concrete collective sentiment. Partly, by the way, since people are forbidden from come together en masse, right? And since there is a real danger in substantial gathering, there is no way to have that. I watched yesterday a vigil at Cornell University where I spent 3 years, and it was heartwarming to watch. And somewhat painful since we can't really have something like that in Israel. You know, allowing hundreds and thousands and many, many thousands, I imagine, of Israelis coming together just to have a quiet moment, mourning what happened on Saturday. We haven't had that opportunity yet, at least, because of the regulations considering the state of war, and that of course makes sense. And when it comes to the division within Israel's society, I think they are still very much there. You can see it reverberating throughout social media. But it's true that here too you have an interesting mismatch between the political division, and really at the heart of it is Netanyahu and the government, juxtaposing that with substantial solidarity. And I think a very, very robust civil society. So on a social level, unlike on the political level, there you can find much more of the people coming together. Of course, not all of them. That's for sure. That's always the case, no matter what. But substantial parts of Israeli society coming together for each other, helping each other, no matter what are their political views, their religious affiliation, whether they're secular or orthodox, trying to help one another and also supporting the IDF. Look, for now, the main support of the IDF is coming not from the government. The main support, whether it is financial, logistical, moral, emotional, is coming from this wonderful, I think, civil society that Israel has, and in many ways was built during those 40 weeks of fighting for democracy against this autocratizing government. So oddly enough, when in Israel we are afraid of the potential of war on two fronts, in actuality, in some ways, there is already war on two fronts going on. On the part of the society, at least. There is one obvious military front against the Hamas, another more political front vis-à-vis the current government. And the current unity government might be a way to try and alleviate some of those tensions. We'll see how that plays out.
That's very interesting that the mobilization against Netanyahu and his assault on democracy in Israel, rather than weakening Israeli resolve, may have actually strengthened it for this moment. That seems to fly in the face of conventional wisdom, which is that the Israeli body politic was divided in such a way that hamstrung its collective resolve.
Right. I absolutely agree with you. The government has shown its weakness. The IDF too has shown its weakness. What led to this catastrophe is the conduct of both, in different aspects, of course, but the conduct of both. And if you'd like, we can get into that aspect later. But in my mind, at least, there is no doubt that the last 40 weeks awakened the Israeli public, large segments, at least, of the Israeli public. And we have seen the wonderful fruits of this awakening in the past 5 days, because these are exactly the people who mobilized to help, both during Saturday itself, in the desperate hour of needs, when people were trying to get hold of anyone in the state institutions, whether it is the police or the military, any sort of officials, for hours on end. And ultimately, many resorted to what we typically call civil society, organization, media that the current government has repeatedly dubbed as treacherous. Those leftists, liberals who are betraying Israel, they were a source of comfort, of coordination for those efforts when the state institutions seem to be at collapse. Look, on Saturday, Israel was a failed state. The sense of Israelis on Saturday was that they are living in a failed state. And it was the civil society that stepped in, and ever since then as well. Those organizations, those individuals, heroic acts of rescuing, people taking the initiative, risking their lives, coming to the south to help people in desperate hour of need. These are matters of life and death in the most acute sense.
Uriel, you wrote an essay a couple of years ago with a fascinating title, The Zionist Absurd, Israel's Politics of Fear, Freedom, and Bad Faith. And in that essay, you note that existential fears have always characterized Zionism from the very beginning. And despite Israel's enormous strength, you say that those fears remain present and indeed prominent. A growing sense that, quote, the whole world is against us no matter what, has engendered what you call the Zionist absurd, a belief that Israel's legitimation efforts are doomed, which you say has led to a kind of bad faith cocktail of essentialism, determinism, and fatalism. So I'd like you to unpack that a bit. And again, you wrote this a few years ago. How does this all look now? Does the current conflagration change this equation?
That's a huge question. Huge question. Look, Zionism was in many ways a response to existential fears. Of course, at the time we're talking about the late 19th century, nobody envisioned, even in his darkest nightmare, the Holocaust. But the sense of urgency was there, that there is an existential danger to Jewish community, especially in Europe, to Judaism, the religion, and to Jewishness, that sense of belonging to the Jewish family, whether you are religious or not. Zionism was supposed to be the answer, was supposed to alleviate that fear. It hasn't. Fear lingered. It's still very much there. We need not wait to Saturday in order to feel it yet again, although of course it was underscored. But the existential fear has been accompanying Zionism as a stalking shadow since its emergence over 140 years ago. What is important in this regard is the way that you respond to that existential fear within Zionism itself. Now, part of the attempt to resolve it was, of course, through peace negotiations, trying to be accepted in the region, trying to gain legitimacy. Legitimacy in the most profound sense of the world, and especially the Arab world and the Muslim world at large, recognizing the right of Jews to consider themselves a people, and the right of the Jewish people to self-determination, political independence. That is the state of Israel, a Jewish state. And what many Israeli Jews experience since the Second Intifada, so we are talking over 20 years now, is that our significant others, Palestinians, do not want to establish a Palestinian state side by side the Jewish state, but in fact are after a Palestinian state instead of the Jewish state. That their intentions are in fact genocidal, or at least they aim for politicide, right? Destroying the Jewish state. And under that paradigm, the very heart of the Zionist project of creating legitimacy seemed doomed. Because if the world is against us, no matter what, if the Palestinian rejects our existence, and the world accepts the Palestinian narrative, then what recourse do we have? And it paved the path to determinism, to fatalism, and to essentialism. That the origins is clear, that it was inevitable, that the end is obvious enough. The world will not accept Israel, the world will not accept Jews, anti-Semitism is here to stay, and that there is something inherent to those who oppose us, especially Arabs, especially Palestinians. This is how things are, this is how they continue to be. And effectively, the more practical aspect of it was that there is no partner for peace. Specifically, there is no Palestinian partner for peace. So in one way or another, the politics of bad faith is about undermining our sense of freedom, undermining our sense of choice, undermining the capacity to learn from mistakes and make things better. The only thing you can do is live by the sword and hope that you'll be able to survive. And Netanyahu was a main agent of that doctrine over the past 30 years.
Yes. And this leads to my final question, which is, you've talked about the rage that a lot of Israelis are feeling in the shocking aftermath of what's happened. And as understandable as those emotions are, I'm wondering if you're concerned about some of the language being used by Israeli officials and others. Language about Palestinians that many see as dehumanizing, phrases like human animals. There's talk of flattening Gaza. There's an increasingly eliminationist rhetoric, not only toward Hamas, but in some cases toward Gaza and its inhabitants, without distinguishing. Some of the statements could be construed as pre-genocidal. And I'm wondering, as an Israeli, but also as a student of political psychology, a theorist of political psychology, what's your sense of this rhetoric and its trajectory?
It's the vicious cycle of humiliation and revenge, and we've seen it throughout the chronicles of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. You feel the fear, you feel the humiliation caused by the others, and you want to extract revenge upon it. If you take it to the theoretical and even the philosophical realm, you find something that is akin to what Greek mythology described in the image of the goddess Nemesis. The goddess Nemesis was named as a sort of punishment for human hubris, that conceit. And I think that conceit is in each and every one of us. I think in some ways, the modern condition is the attempt to run away from the human condition. Vain. What we have in the human condition is the frailty, fragility of who we are, and the capacity to make choices. We have both these aspects in our humanity. We try to run away from that, and politics is one way to do that. Like the biblical story of the Tower of Babel, to be godlike, to be all-powerful, to be all-righteous, completely authentic. We try to be all that, but it is exactly that significant others, Palestinians in the case of Israelis, the Israelis in the case of the Palestinians, who proves to us that we are frail, that we are in fact human. And enraged, we try to dehumanize them. Precisely because by them we witness yet again how fragile we are. And you can see those psychopolitical dynamics going on both sides. Both are trying to boost their omnipotency. Look how strong we are. I don't know if you had a chance to look at the horrendous social media video clips and images that the men of the Hamas spread. It's horrible to watch. And it's so very clear that in their mind, what they are proving then and there with that ongoing humiliation, brutalizing those people, they are proving to themselves and maybe to the world how mighty they are. They are not. They are human. as we are. And every time we sense again that fragility, that mortality by the end of the day, we feel that urge to avenge. And we do it again and again and again. This is what the conflict has been thriving on. And yet I think that it need not be this way. I think that by the end of the day, although it may sound completely ludicrous and utopian at this dark point, I think that it might also serve as a sort of an awakening for moderates on both sides. And I think there is substantial majority, certainly among Palestinians, Arabs living in Israel, but even in the territories, many Palestinians who abhor what the Hamas has done. I think there is a potential, precisely because we see where this vicious cycle can lead us to, that the moderates on both sides may come together and try to truly do something that we haven't really tried before, which is a real coexistence, truly fully recognizing the existence of the other, trying to make that joint lived experience better for both peoples. It sounds utopian, but I think there are many people on both sides who are capable, who are willing to make that move. In some ways, we are all held hostage by our leaderships. Politicians will not resolve this conflict. It will be up to the public.
Uriel Abulof, thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much, Danny.
Uriel Abulof in Jerusalem. This has been The Lead, a podcast from New Lines magazine. You can find our guests, Jeroen and Uriel, on Twitter at Gunning Jeroen and Sapienology, and Dana on Blue Sky at danaelkurd.bsky.social. This week's episode was hosted by me, Danny Postel, and produced and co-hosted by Joshua Martin. For more like this, subscribe to The Lead on your favorite podcast app or visit our website, newlinesmag.com. Thank you all for joining us.